Good time of the day, dear students. Today we're going to talk about the importance of translation in mass media. And at first, let's talk about the importance of translation theory and practice. Why translation was so amazing and interesting subject. And besides, we may talk about translation theory as a subject, independent subject. However, it developed many centuries ago when Aristotle, Cicero and Horace, who were fluent in Latin and Greek, translated different Christian and scientific papers into their languages. And later it developed during the time of Renaissance, when Bartholomew and Manetti in Rome, Dubillé and Malherbe in France, Bacon and Dryden in England, Goethe and Humboldt in Germany, Lomonosov and Sumarokov in Russia, and if we talk about Uzbek translators, Ibrahim Haqqul, Mahsud Shaykhzoda, Yusuf Shah Mansur, Jamal Kamal, Abdullah Salam, who were significant scientists and researchers in translation theory and practice during the 20th century in Uzbekistan. And telling the truth, translation theory and practice developed at the end of the 19th century as an independent subject and was greatly developed during the middle of the 20th century in Russia, and at the end, from the middle till the end of the 20th century in Uzbekistan. And nowadays the theories of these great scientists are still elaborated by many researchers in these fields. And the most important principle in translation is, as mentioned Horace or Aristotle, not to translate the words word for word, not to make a literal translation, but convey the meaning of the translation, of the source material to the target material. And this principle still remains and considers as a main ethics of any kind of translation. So let's move to the topic mass media and translation. Translation of mass media is also one of the important aspects and branches of translation theory and practice, because mass media is a means of communication, means of intercultural communication, means of uniting all citizens around the world. Translation of mass media starts with translating news, and this news may be the news about wars, international conflicts, or particular conflicts in one area. Take the example of refugee crisis, for example, refugee crisis in Afghanistan, Syria, or any other countries where conflict has grown up. And this important news makes people aware about the world information and makes people not to be a citizen of one particular country, but a citizen of the whole universe, of the whole world, and be alert and always be ready to support and assist people who are in struggle. And this is very important in translation of mass media. Well, translating of mass media, not only about the translation of bad news, about the wars, about the conflicts or any other things, and for example earthquakes and so on, but also translation of, for example, business news. Business news are also very important in translation because business translation should be very accurate, and accurate translation in this kind of information makes the source very attractive for businessmen around the world, and also make a great contribution to have different joint ventures, international cooperations, and other different international business conferences. And that's why accurate translation in business sphere and any other sphere are very important. Well, staying informed about what is happening around the world will help us keep an open mind and know how to handle certain situation. Without a professional translation company, mass media would have a hard time delivering accurate translations of events from around the world to other countries. The language of mass media isn't just one, but should actually be every translation language that could inform a crowd of a new situation. Okay, if we talk about translation in the media, and sometimes translation of mass media may refer to entertaining the masses. Entertaining the masses is also one of the great means to unite people around the world, because usually in entertaining the masses, editors and administrators of these sources usually provide viral videos and pictures that can understand any person around the world, and there is no need for translation these kind of materials. And that's why by entertaining the masses, people can be easily united and feel tuned in a one line. That is very interesting. Language and mass media come hand in hand when it comes to entertaining worldwide audience. News from around the world doesn't have to be sad and nerve-wracking for those who read them. They can also be fun and entertaining, and even a way to help many people to cope with difficulties in their everyday life. And because in these kind of entertaining media, people may find some life hacks, interesting information, how to cope with obstacles, and it is very interesting. That is because it's provided in videos and pictures that can be easily understood. Articles. If we talk about translation of articles, it also has particular ethics. For example, administration of each newspaper or journal or official magazine may have their own rules of translation articles, and in this case translators should be very accurate and save the main ethics of the editorial. The translation of articles depends on the audience. What kind of audience is reading this particular journal and magazine? And what are the expectations of the audience from reading this kind of article? And it doesn't mean that translators should distort according to the requirement of the audience. They still need to obey the main ethics of translation, to save the main content, to save the main meaning of the article. That is very, very important. Translation ethics. For example, if we talk about ethics, usually the term ethics indicates codes of human behavior, or that dictate whether or not an action is good or bad, right or wrong. In many cases, ethics differ from person to person, depending on their personal values, their beliefs, structures, and values. One person may condone an action while another may condemn it. So, something that is right in particular community may be totally different, may be totally wrong in another community. The same ethics may be established in particular translation area, and each state, each administration, each type of translation has its own ethics. The translation of articles may have their own ethics, whereas translation of cartoons or advertisement or films may stick to different regulations. And this is ethics, rules of different types of translation. Well, there are different strategies of translation. Maybe you're already aware of them. The most important and the most ancient type of translation is literal translation, when translators translate everything word for word. Literal translation. And is a translation of a text done by translating each word separately without looking at how the words are used together in a phrase or sentence. Well, this kind of translation may not be sufficient to translate some literary novels or some poems or artistic documents, artistic sources. But this doesn't mean that literal translation is useless. It is also very, very useful in particular sphere like science sphere, chemistry, biology, medicine, math. These kind of science subjects require literal translation, and translators cannot use any other kind of translations because everything should be exact. Well, faithful translation simply means the translator aims to convey the author's intention of the text, what the author was intending to communicate, as faithfully as possible into another language. When you just want to convey the main meaning of the author, and faithful translation may not be implemented in scientific subjects, but it can be used in any other kind of sources, again according to the ethics of the translation editorial, the rules of the administration or state that usually offer particular translated material. Semantic translation is another type of translation strategy. Is the process of using semantic information to aid in the translation of data in one representation of or data model to another representation or data model. Semantic translation takes advantage of semantic that associate meaning with individual data elements in one dictionary to create an equivalent meaning in a second system. In short, we may say translation of meanings. Adaptations. You have already heard about these words. Adaptations are usually used for translation of movies, very long novels, and different scenarios. Usually adaptations are used for the scenarios that is not found in the target language and where there is no reference for this kind of source material. Free translation. This kind of translation doesn't depend on the requirements and expectations of the audience. In free translation, translators or interpreters may choose their own way of translation. They choose, and this kind of translations may be used in translation of different novels, different books. But again, free translation cannot be used in scientific subjects, where literal and exact translation is very, very important. Well, a next type of translation, idiomatic translation. Idiomatic translation refers to achieving a target text that sounds natural in the target language, while idiomatic expressions are idioms or fixed expressions in a given language. Idiomatic translation is used to make a target material more appealing, more interesting, and some word combinations, collocations in the source material may be substituted with phraseological units, idioms, to make a target material appealing, more attractive. Communicative translation uses to render the exact contextual meaning of the original in such a way that both content and language are readily acceptable and comprehensible to the readership. Sometimes the source material may be too much complicated. In this case, in order to achieve immense or immediate feedback from the readership, from the audience, in this case, translators use communicative translation. It is to make the source material, and translated target material more understandable and comprehensible to the audience. Translation in advertisement is also very important in translation of mass media, and it has its own ethics, it has its own rules. For example, most translations, in order to be easily understood and remembered, usually made in verses. And sometimes it is very difficult to find exact words, and it cannot be same as it in the source material. And translators try to substitute these verses and rhymes in the poems of advertisements with different words, but the main ethics of translation of advertisement, translators always should remain the mood and style of advertisement. That is very, very important. The mood and style and the tune and what the main intention of the advertisement should be saved. However, the words may be changed. These stages, as we know, involve translation and editing, or rather trans-editing. So, if we talk about translation of news, it is a kind of process process of editing, or rather trans-editing. That means translation and editing. Transforming the language and structure of the original message by using strategies such as reorganization and the strategies that we mentioned before. This is the reorganization of the source material to the target material. This process is called as reorganization, deletion. Sometimes we delete some structures, some phrases, addition and substitution. Well, translation in songs, it is also very interesting strategy. It has its own rules and regulations, its own ethics. So one style of translation of songs is called mondegreen. Is about mishearing or misinterpretation of a phrase as a result of near homophony in a way that gives a new meaning. Mondegreen are most often created by a person listening to a poem or song, the listener being unable to clearly hear a lyric, substitutes words that sound similar and make some kind of a sense. Well, mondegreen means when you translate the song, you may create such a word that is very, very similar, like it was in a sound, like it was in a source song, and translators may find the same, almost same word as it sounds in the source song, but it has very clear meaning to the source word. This is a process of mondegreen, but it dates back to the ancient period when translators of songs just occasionally misheard or misinterpreted the words in the song. That is very interesting. But now translators do it intentionally, deliberately. They try to find similar words as if the audience should listen to this song as it was in the source material. Translation in cartoons. Cartoons translation appears to be a special field in screen translation. It can be argued that when translating cartoons, creativity in use of the target language could be explored, and a certain degree of rewriting of the language of the dialect could be acceptable, so that strategies should be applied to receive the effect that translated version sounds natural, educational and entertaining to the target language audience. Well, both dubbing and subtitling countries choose to dub cartoons because the main audience of the cartoons are very young generation, children who don't have such capacity as adults. They don't have such capacity at the same time to watch the video and read the captures beneath the screen. It is very difficult for children. Therefore, all countries, subtitling countries like China or USA, and dubbing countries as Russia or Uzbekistan, both translate by dubbing. They dub cartoons. And translation of cartoons should be very interesting, educational, and entertaining. It should be suitable for the target audience, and we know that the target audience of cartoons are children. Translation in films, that is another kind of screen translation, or in other words we may say audio-visual translation. There are two major types of film translation. They are dubbing and subtitling. Each of them interferes with original text to a different extent. Each of them has its own purpose. Dubbing, if the audience wants to feel particular domestication of the source film into their own language, they usually choose dubbing films or dubbed films, because in dubbing there is a process of domestication. Translators try to make such translation in a translation. Even the mouths of the actors or actresses in the film move in the same way as it was in the source film, in the source version of the film. And this is the dubbing. And if the audience wants to feel the foreigners' real atmosphere of the source film, for example, real atmosphere of China, real atmosphere of England, USA, or any other foreign country, they may choose just subtitling films and enjoy the real sounds, real emotions of the actors, real culture, just paying attention to some unclear places by focusing to words and phrases that are written in different captures. Types of challenges in media translation. I wouldn't say that these challenges may appear only in media translation, but these challenges you may confront in any kind of translation. So the purpose of language is communication. If that fails, language is useless. A good translator should be familiar with the culture, history, beliefs of the people who speak both languages. If the translator is not fluent in both languages, her success is threatened. And that's why knowing the language itself isn't sufficient to be a good translator. Translators should be aware of all aspects of the target and his own native language. One of the most important challenging factors in translation is the language structure. The more difficult structure in the context, the more complicated is translation. It is apparent. For example, different languages has its own rules. For example, subject, verb, object in English language, but this structure is different in Uzbek and Russian language. Translators should be aware of this phenomena. And if the structure of the sentences is very, very complicated, and in this case, translators, it is very good advice to fragment these complicated sentences into several sentences and make the translation more easier. The structure of language is directly related to the level of accuracy and simplicity of the translation. The simpler the language is, the easier it is to translate that language to another one. And another challenge in translation is translation of phraseological units or idioms. There is no any electronic device, and even Google Translator cannot provide accurate translation for idioms. And in order to translate some idioms, for example, she has a goo-goo eyes on me. It is one of the American idioms. In order to understand the real meaning of this idiom, people should live in USA or to be very, very closely aware of American culture and expression of different idioms. Language structure. Every language has a unique structure. The structure of language is directly related to the level of accuracy and simplicity of the language translation. And another type of challenges in translation is compound words. And I would mention several types of compound words. For example, when compound words, in one compound word, both words has its own meanings. For example, afternoon or any time. In these compound words, both parts of the words has its own meaning, and they save their meaning in these compound words. And it may not pose any challenges for translators to translate these kind of words. However, there are also another type of compound words like seashore or underground. They also have their own meanings, and it's not very difficult to translate these kind of compound words. And another type of compound words, when one part of compound words has save the meaning in these words, but another partially lose. For example, bellboy or bookworm. When we think about bellboy, we don't think about bell, but we think about a person, a man who rings a bell. And bellboy, a person who rings a bell, may be a boy or elderly person, anyone who rings a bell. Or in another word, bookworm. When we think about bookworm, it is not associated with a worm. We cannot imagine a worm, but we think about the person who loves to read a book. And in this case also, the meaning of the compound words partially lost. And some compound words may be very, very challenging. For example, in the words deadline or butterfly, both parts of this compound word has nothing with their core meaning. For example, deadline. There is no association with death or lion, but this is the final acceptable period of something. The acceptable period or the period of delivery. This is a deadline. Or butterfly. There is no association with butter or fly. This is a type of insect that has this kind of form in compound words. Or missing names. For example, guest room. This room is exists in American English when when hosts provide a special room to stay at night for guests. But in Uzbek language, we don't have this kind of room. However, mehmonxona, we have mehmonxona, but with different purpose. Not for the person who wants to stay at night, but in this room, people may sit and have dinner or lunch, or just gather with different guests and have some meal. And it has a little bit different purpose. And pay attention, missing names. Some words may be dropped in Greek, for example, xnona, that is translated in one word, or camera per gliospiti in Italian. There were 3 words, not 2. 2-word verbs, for example, look up, close up, fill out, shut up, bring up, break down. These kind of 2-word verbs or collocations are common in verbal communication or in informal communication. And in this case, interpreters should be very, very attentive. And it wouldn't be a good idea to use this kind of informal 2-word verbs like collocations in academic and scientific sources when translating the academic and scientific articles. And if even the translators use these kind of phrases, 2-word verbs, they should be very, very accurate and attentive to the meaning of the prepositions, because they always vary. And some words may provide multiple meanings. For example, the word scale. This word may sound similar but has 3 different meanings. For example, in examples we can see scale the fish completely before weighing it on the scale. Here in the sentence, scale has 2 different kind of meanings. However, it has one more meaning that in translation calls масштаб. Yes, we know about it. Words that sound different. For example, the word windy or windy. Let's see it in the Example, I drove down the windy road on a windy day. Here again, if the translator doesn't know the meaning of these words and will translate on the one meaning, the meaning of the sentence will change. Or the translation of sarcasm. Sarcasm is expressing something bitter. When we say something in sarcasm, we mean totally different thing. And if the translator doesn't know this style of expression, the translation may fail. Sarcasm, translators should know the meaning of the sarcasms and make a suitable translation. And for our today's lecture, this is all material that was provided, and I think the lecture was very interesting and informative for you, because in our modern world, translation of media, translation of information, news is very important. Different internet resources, television, newspaper, magazines, nowadays in contemporary world provide us with different information, advertisement, articles, and as people who read or enjoy with this kind of information, we should know how to detect different types of translation in order to understand the real meaning of the material. And we can, by knowing this kind of information, we may identify different types of translation of audiovisual materials, like translation of cartoons, films, dubbing films, subtitling films, why they are important, what kind of purposes they have. And this is very interesting. And I hope that everybody enjoyed our today's lecture, and this is the end of our today's lesson, and see you in our next lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.